Our first takeaway is in regard to the following quote: "Human-centered design is the process of ensuring that people's needs are met, that the resulting product is understandable and usable, that it accomplishes the desired tasks, and that the experience of use is positive and enjoyable." What we really took away from this quote is how important human-centered design is. Particularly, we liked how it focused on the individualized aspect of it, one that seeks out to strengthen positive and enjoyable experiences for human beings. As teachers, we believe that such design helps bring out the best of our students, as it helps them figure out their values and who they are as individuals within a learning context. When I asked the group if they see themselves implementing human-centered design or activity-centered design in their classroom, the majority leaned towards human-centered design, but of course, concerns were brought up. We talked about how the varying difficulties that come with implementing human-centered design can depend on discipline, grade, and resources available. For example, subject areas such as science and art can have an easier degree of incorporating design, as it is already prevalent within those areas. However, subjects such as math or music require much more critical thinking in how to implement design in those areas. For our next takeaway, we focused on the following quote: "Design researchers must carefully adjust the focus of their observations to the intended market and people for whom the product is intended. In this instance, it is very simple to switch out the design vocabulary for teaching vocabulary, and the same still applies. For example, teachers must carefully adjust their focus of their observations to their lessons and their students for whom the learning is intended." This quote really strengthens the idea of design being present in the everyday aspect of our lives. It's just typically phrased differently to fit the context it's in. Of course, in this teaching sense, we discussed how crucial it is to always be designing for our students. They are the most important market we need to account for. I found that our next takeaway was the most important one in our discussion. It circulated around the statement of how we have to accept that we might learn from a failed idea or prototype as we learn from a successful one. It may seem like an easy thing to do, but many of us are hardwired to see our mistakes as failures. We discussed how much of it stems from either upbringing with strict parents expecting good grades to get into university, or how standardized education has taught us that if we get bad marks, we quote-unquote have failed and won't be successful. We also believe that as teachers, this idea of mistakes equaling failing is more predominant. After all, you are often under the impression that if you make a mistake, it doesn't only impact you, but it impacts all of your students as well. One particular example that was brought up was our practicum experiences. While these are treated as learning opportunities, there is still a very large degree of stressing out over mistakes. The pressure is on once there is a qualified teacher observing you and taking notes on your progress, as well as the added aspect of having a field instructor come and mark you during the observation period. However, what's important to take away is that we truly need to start seeing our failures as learning experiences. It involves adapting a growth mindset, which hopefully our own students will adapt from us if they see that we see failures as learning experiences. One of my group mates brought up the idea of reformed overthinking in regards to mistakes as learning experiences. You might still overthink the mistake, but more so without the stressful part, as in you're using it to develop and grow from. For our last takeaway, we considered how valuable it is to really evolve our problem-solving skills. As the quote states, "It is amazing how often people solve the problem before them before bothering to question it." Again, this is very much a product of standardized education, as in a high-stakes test situation, we simply don't have the time to look at a problem and think it through. Rather, we want to solve it as quickly and correctly as possible to move on to another question. Since we have learned to solve problems in this way, as we grow older, we tend to not think over concrete problems and their many solutions. We always rely on quick and easy ways out. We talked about how we're grateful that the new Alberta curriculum has shifted its concentration on students developing core competencies, such as problem solving and critical thinking. Of course, as teachers, it is important that we design lessons that help foster these competencies. Our 4 takeaways were derived from our discussion that very much focused on design in general. To start off our discussion, I began with a very simple question: how familiar are you with the concept of design? I wanted to gauge what perspectives my group mates had on it. The word web on this page shows the words that came up during this discussion, such as planning, development, pattern, ideas, You can tell that much of these words focus on design terms found within design careers, such as art and architecture. Funny enough, we found out that a lot of us prior to choosing a teaching degree were interested in pursuing interior designing. We then talked about design within a school context and how familiar we are with it. Of course, many things that we've learned from previous classes came up, such as designing lesson plans, assessment strategies, and the universal design for learning. I personally have knowledge of classroom design from a professional development session I've attended. When we learned about this kind of design, however, we really never clearly thought about how the design process related to it. So when we're designing a lesson plan, we weren't really thinking about the design process at the time. We really hope that this class will really allow us to view the intricacies of how we can design for learning on a more detailed level. The following 3 questions in this presentation highlight what I think were the most important questions of our discussion, as I found that we had much to discuss. They brought up many highlights to our thoughts on design for learning. For the first question, I asked my group if they agreed with the quote, "Many teachers remain unsure what design means or how to apply it." The majority of us strongly disagreed with it. We found that in our day and age, many teachers are familiar with incorporating design to fit the needs of their classrooms. That being said, it depends. McKenna mentioned that she's seen proper and improper design being utilized by teachers, so it truly depends on the teacher. One thing that was brought up was the relevancy on this article, considering it was written in 2017. I personally thought that the idea of design being unfamiliar to teachers would have been an old idea, so I was surprised to see that it's relatively new. However, we all believe that an article written in 2022 would be much different, especially considering with how COVID certainly changed design for learning, as it forced teachers to completely revamp their lessons so they worked in an online setting. Of course, some teachers may struggle with how to apply design depending on the subject they teach, as previously mentioned in my takeaway on human-centered design. In addition, we talked a little bit about the idea of seeing failures as learning experiences here. That idea is certainly one I believe teachers are constantly working on. I don't think there is such thing as a teacher who makes no mistakes at all. For the next question, I asked my group which stage of design thinking they personally resonated with. Surprisingly, not one individual chose the same one as another, so we were spread out throughout the board. I believed defining the problem was most important, as I think it's vital to explore the problem in its entirety, to understand it, and of course to pick out its root problem. If you don't pick it out in its initial stages, then you may need to restart the entire process later on in the design, if it doesn't work out. Alex T. believed ideating was most important, as she personally likes the aspect of brainstorming and considering multiple solutions. Jada thought both prototyping and testing were key, and that you couldn't have one without the other. She mentioned how it's very much an alternation of the two, and of course, the funnest stage as you get to put your initial ideas into practice. And finally, McKenna believed that emphasizing with stakeholders is the most important, as she believed you cannot get started with the design process without consulting the stakeholders you are designing for. Question 3 was definitely more of a food for thought question for myself. I was curious to know the group's thoughts on this. The question states that when designing their lessons, teachers will often borrow or acquire materials from numerous resources, such as Teachers Pay Teachers, Pinterest, colleagues, etc. After having read the required readings, has your stance changed on how materials from these resources should be implemented in the classroom? After having our discussion around the readings, many of us agreed. A concrete resource evaluation is required when using materials from other sites. A teacher shouldn't simply use these materials on the fly or in a last-minute scenario where they didn't prepare a proper lesson plan. In addition, these resources can stem from other countries as well, so we have to keep in mind whether they meet learning outcomes set out by the curriculum of our province. What I found most interesting is that the group claimed that when it comes to getting materials or resources from teacher friends or colleagues, they can be accepted without a second thought. This is as a result of knowing that what they have to offer is most likely a tried and true method that worked within their own classrooms. But of course, it's still important to evaluate the resource's relevancy nevertheless. To sum up the main ideas of this discussion and how we can apply them to our future practice are the following points. Number 1, we need to perceive failures using a growth mindset. Even if you are someone who is hard on themselves for errors, it's important to start a journey of seeing them as helpful experiences instead. Number 2, use the stages of design thinking as a framework when creating lessons. It's a useful process and it can be really key in developing proper lesson plans or activities in a classroom, especially since you have all your steps laid out. Number 3, students are the intended market you produce a design for. Teachers should definitely not be designing for themselves. After all, it's going to be the students who get the most out of your lesson, not yourself. Maybe 1% of the design aspect of it addresses the teacher. Obviously, you want your lesson to be easy to teach, the way you want to teach it. However, the 99% is definitely geared towards students.